September 2003 marked a turning point in the development of Western civilization. It was the month that Adbusters magazine started accepting orders for the Black Spot sneaker, its own signature brand of subversive running shoes. After that day, no rational person could possibly believe that there's any tension between mainstream and alternative culture. After that day, it became obvious to everyone that cultural rebellion of the type epitomized by Adbusters magazine is not a threat to the system, it is the system. Founded in 1989, Adbusters is the flagship publication of the culture jamming movement. In their view, society has become so thoroughly permeated with propaganda and lies, largely as a consequence of advertising, that the culture as a whole has become an enormous system of ideology, all designed to reproduce faith in the system. The goal of the culture jammers is quite literally to jam the culture by subverting the messages used to reproduce this faith and blocking the channels through which it is propagated. This in turn is thought to have radical political consequences. In 1999, Adbusters editor Kalle Lassen argued that culture jamming, quote, will become to our era what civil rights was to the 60s, what feminism was to the 70s, what environmental activism was to the 80s. 10 years later, he's using the Adbusters brand to flog his own trademark line of running shoes. It's worth mentioning that in a copycat move, Mother Jones magazine is now marketing, I believe it's called the No Sweat sneaker. And I believe in a defensive move, Converse is now marketing the Imagine sneaker, which has the lyrics to John Lennon's Imagine printed on it. So you can sort of see where this is going. Anyhow, what happened? Did Adbusters sell out? Our answer is absolutely not. And I think it's extremely important that we all see and understand this. Adbusters did not sell out because there's nothing to sell out in the first place. They never had a revolutionary doctrine. What they had was a warmed-over version of the countercultural thinking that has dominated leftist politics since the 1960s. And this type of countercultural politics, far from being a revolutionary doctrine, has been one of the primary forces driving consumer capitalism for the past 40 years. In other words, what we see on display in Adbusters magazine is, and always has been, the true spirit of capitalism. The episode with the running shoes just serves to prove the point. Kalle Lassen describes the sneaker project as, quote, a groundbreaking marketing scheme to uncool Nike. He said, if it succeeds, it will set a precedent that will revolutionize capitalism. But how exactly is this supposed to revolutionize capitalism? Reebok, Adidas, Puma, Vans, and a half dozen other companies, they've been trying to uncool Nike for decades. That's called marketplace competition. It's called identifying a niche and exploiting it. In fact, it is the whole point of capitalism. Lassen defends his sneaker project against various critics, pointing out that his shoes, unlike those of his rivals, will not be manufactured in sweatshops, although they will be manufactured at a factory in Portugal where, and this is a quotation taken straight from the Black Spot sneaker website, a factory in Portugal where, quote, the owners have a reputation for being excellent employers. Although many of the employees in the factories have cars, others are often seen walking home through vineyards and olive groves during the course of the workday to enjoy their 1.5-hour lunch break, waving to bosses and neighbors as they pass. This is nice. But ideas like fair trade and ethical marketing are hardly revolutionary ideas, and they certainly represent no threat to the capitalist system. If consumers are willing to pay more for shoes made by happy workers, or for eggs laid by happy chickens, then there is money to be made in bringing these goods to market. It's a business model that has already been successfully exploited to great effect by the Body Shop and Starbucks, among other companies. Now, we use this little episode to help us understand what we call the paradox of anti-consumerism. Because the type of anti-consumerism that's represented in Adbusters magazine has become one of the most important cultural forces in millennial North American life, across every class and social demographic. Sure, as a society, we're collectively spending record amounts of money on luxury goods, vacations, designer clothing, household comforts. But take a look at the nonfiction bestseller lists. For years, they've been dominated by books that are deeply critical of consumerism. No Logo, Culture Jam, Luxury Fever, Fast Food Nation. You can now buy Adbusters at your local music store, your clothing store, and so on. Two of the most popular and critically acclaimed films in the past decade were Fight Club and American Beauty, both of which offered almost identical indictments of modern consumer society. So what can we conclude from this? Well, one thing we conclude is that the market does an extremely good job at responding to consumer demand for anti-consumerist products. There was actually an article on this in the New York Times a while ago called The Alienation Market. It talked about the corporation, Michael Moore's movies, and so on. But at the same time, how can we all denounce consumerism and still find ourselves living in a consumer society? I think if we did a quick straw poll in this room and I asked everyone who's in favor of consumerism to put up their hands, I'm not sure there'd be that many takers. But this is the puzzle, right? I mean, everybody seems to be opposed to the shallow, materialistic nature of contemporary consumer culture, and yet nothing ever seems to change. But somebody's doing all the shopping. Everybody's a rebel in their own way, and yet the system continues along its merry way, completely unperturbed. If anything, the system seems to be getting stronger, and consumerism seems to be getting worse. So I think what we need to do is step back a bit and try to figure out how we've gotten ourselves into this situation. And in particular, we need to ask ourselves two questions. First of all, what exactly are people rebelling against? Second, how are they rebelling when they claim to be striking a blow against consumerism? Now, the answer can be stated quite simply, but we're academics, so we won't. So what we'll do is we'll unpack the story a bit for you. Most of the rebellion against consumer society has taken the form of what we call countercultural rebellion. It's a sort of rebellion that's based upon an implicit theory of society, which we refer to, following Thomas Frank, who wrote the book The Conquest of Cool, as the countercultural idea. And it's an idea that emerged out of the so-called critique of mass society, a set of ideas developed primarily in the 1950s, and which has gone on to dominate the radical political imagination since the 1960s. The central idea of the critique of mass society is quite simple. It's that the enormous wealth of our society is based upon the technology of mass production. You've got the factory and the assembly line, the hierarchically organized corporation, and the impersonal state bureaucracy. We accept all of this because we appreciate the wealth that the system produces, largely in the form of creature comforts and household consumer goods. But it's a Faustian bargain because in accepting the benefits of the machine of mass society, we must also submit to its discipline. So according to the critique of mass society, capitalism requires conformity in order to function, not just among workers, but also among consumers. This is because mass production generates an enormous oversupply of homogeneous goods, which threaten to outstrip demand. Thus, the system must instill a set of manufactured desires in the population to consume ever greater quantities of these mass-produced goods. In other words, the system requires conformity. Conformity among the workers who run the machines, and conformity among the consumers who purchase the products. Yet there can't be mass consumption without widespread agreement as to what the needs and wants of life are. Thus, the system requires substantial psychological unity among the masses, a set of uniform manufactured desires. And the only way this can be achieved is through extensive psychological manipulation of the population. In a consumer society, this is the function of advertising. Thus, conformity of life and conformity of thought are indissolubly linked as a complacent and passive population submits itself to the demands of mass society in order to achieve the ever-elusive rewards promised them by advertising. So this is the story. I'm not telling you that this is the story. This is the critique of mass society that we think is underlying a lot of the rebellion. Now, it's important to understand that this is not just a theory about capitalism narrowly construed or narrowly conceived. It's a theory about our entire culture. So according to this theory, our culture is a completely integrated system in which every sector or institution, including the state, the churches, the medical establishment, and so on, each of these institutions supports the others in reinforcing this demand for conformity. The education system in particular plays a vital role because it's in the schools where children have their independence and their creativity literally beaten out of them. We call this, Joe and I call this the Pink Floyd theory of education. After the scene in the movie The Wall, right, where a bunch of uniform-clad students are standing on a conveyor belt singing, "We don't need no education, we don't need no thought control," as they're slowly being fed into a meat grinder. Everyone's like, yeah, grade 6. It follows from this analysis of mass society as a totalizing system of enforced conformity that in order to effect change, it's not necessary to engage in traditional political action in the manner of, say, the old-fashioned socialists. There's no need to form political coalitions, no need to lobby politicians, no need to even work within standard party structures. In fact, this sort of engagement is likely to be seen as counterproductive because all it does is validate and reinforce the existing order. According to the countercultural idea, what people need to be liberated from is not a specific class that oppresses them, or from a system of exploitation that imposes poverty on them. It's because people have become trapped in a gilded cage and have been taught to love their own enslavement. Society controls them by limiting the imagination and suppressing their deepest needs. So what they need to escape from is conformity, and to do so, they must reject the culture in its entirety. They must form a counterculture, one based on freedom and individuality. Theodore Roszak, whose 1969 book, The Making of a Counterculture, introduced the term counterculture into general usage, he referred to this system of mass manipulation as a technocracy. He said, because the discipline of the machine and the factory floor have been extended to encompass every dimension of human life, nothing short of a total rejection of the entire culture and society will suffice. In Roszak's view, traditional leftist parties, not to mention communists and trade unionists, have become the stooges of the technocracy. He said, quote, "This brand of politics finishes with merely redesigning the turrets and towers of the technocratic citadel. It is the foundations of the edifice that must be sought." And Roszak wasn't the only one who thought this way. Charles Reich, in his best-selling book, The Greening of America, writes, quote, "The revolution must be cultural. For culture controls the economic and political machine, not vice versa. The machinery turns out what it pleases and forces people to buy. But if the culture changes, the machine has no choice but to comply." So the upshot of this critique of mass society is that the best way to rebel against the system is to be a nonconformist. That is to say, if the culture demands conformity, one can resist the system by engaging in non-standard cultural activities. And you can see this quite clearly in the so-called hippie version of the counterculture, where doing guerrilla theater, playing in a band, making avant-garde art, taking drugs, having lots of wild sex. All of these are seen as ways of sticking it to the man. Most importantly, they're seen as having huge political consequences. Since then, the list of things that have been considered subversive has grown quite long. There's a very long list in the book, I won't read the whole thing, but among them we find fashion statements ranging from long hair for men and short hair for women, every form of popular music, including jazz, rock, punk, and rap, extreme sports like surfing, skateboarding, and snowboarding, and social innovations like birth control, divorce, interracial sex, gay marriage, and postmodernism. And it's important to see what a profound reorientation of radical politics this represents. Traditional leftist concerns, such as poverty, living standards, or access to medical care, come to be seen as superficial in the sense that they only aim at institutional reform. The counterculture, by contrast, is interested in what Roszak calls the psychic liberation of the oppressed. Thus, the hipster cooling his heels in a jazz club comes to be seen as a more profound critic of modern society than the civil rights activist working to enlist voters, or the feminist politician campaigning for a constitutional amendment. Even more problematic is we begin to see that with the critique of mass society, we see the emergence of what Thomas Frank, again, calls the rebel consumer. If the system requires the same level of conformity among consumers that it does among workers, then it stands to reason that you can fight back against the system simply by refusing to consume the mass-produced goods that the system tries to foist upon you. You bake your own bread, you design your own home, you buy handmade pottery, and so on. And I think this is where we need to stop and rethink things. Because the idea that shopping could be politically radical, as long as you do it right, sounds a bit too good to be true. The ideology of the rebel consumer is based upon the idea that consumerism is driven by a desire to conform. Yet, few people believe this is true of themselves, right? It's always the people down the road who are the compulsive conformists. And it's true, sometimes kids demand a particular style of jeans or a given brand of sneakers in order to fit in. And they say, oh, all the other kids have them. But how many adults actually act this way, right? Most adults spend their money not on things that help them fit in, but on things that allow them to stand out from the crowd. They spend their money on goods that confer distinction. People buy what makes them feel superior, whether by showing that they are cooler, better connected, better informed, more discerning, morally superior, or just plain richer than everybody else. Consumerism, in other words, would appear to be a product of consumers trying to outdo one another, which means that it's competitive consumption that causes the problem, not conformity. If consumers were conformists, then we would just all go out and buy exactly the same stuff and everybody would be happy. And furthermore, there would be no reason to go out and buy anything new. So the desire to conform, this idea that we're all trying to conform, it fails to explain the compulsive nature of consumer behavior, why we keep spending more and more, even though we're all overextended, and even though it doesn't bring anybody any happiness in the long run. So the question is, why do we lay the blame for consumerism on those who are struggling to keep up with the Joneses? Because the fault would actually appear to lie with the Joneses. They're the ones who started it all by trying to one-up their neighbors. It's their desire to stand out from the crowd, to be better than everyone else, that is responsible for ratcheting up consumption standards in their community. In other words, it's the non-conformists, not the conformists, who are driving consumer spending.
One way to get a handle on the problem of consumerism in our society is to look at the results coming out of recent happiness research, which is starting to have a lot of impact in the economics profession. Some of these research results are sort of unsurprising. For example, they discovered that people in wealthy industrialized societies are, on average, happier than people who live in poor ones. And it's not hard to imagine why. With greater wealth comes greater ability to satisfy our needs and desires, to alleviate suffering and illness, and to carry out our life projects. From this, we might reasonably conclude that economic growth is a good thing. Unfortunately, there's an unexpected twist in the story. While economic development has been shown to generate a steady increase in average happiness levels, after a certain level of development has been reached, the effect disappears completely. The rule of thumb developing amongst economists who study the subject is that once GDP reaches about US 10,000 per capita, further economic growth generates no gains in average happiness. In North America, we hit that level long ago. So despite spectacular economic growth since the Second World War, there's been no overall increase in happiness. Some studies even show a decrease in the United States in particular. So there's something very puzzling about this. It would not be surprising to find that as the country becomes richer and richer, additional economic growth generates increasingly smaller improvements in average happiness levels. That would be just diminishing marginal returns. What is shocking is the discovery that growth ceases to produce any improvements at all. Every year our economy pumps up more cars, more houses, more consumer electronics, more labor-saving appliances, more restaurant meals, more of everything. Furthermore, the quality of these goods increases dramatically year after year. Looking around a typical suburban home, the most striking feature is the sheer abundance of material goods. But how could all of this stuff, why are people buying it if it fails to please them? Of course, in the middle of all this wealth, the middle class continues to complain about feeling squeezed economically. People are working harder, under more stress, and are finding themselves with less free time. It's no wonder that they're not especially happy. But how could wealth bring about such consequences? Now that we're richer, shouldn't we all be working less? So this is what we identify as the problem of consumerism, and we try to develop a relatively neutral definition of the problem. Usually when people define consumerism, their definition sort of presupposes their pet critique of it. Whereas what we try to do is come up with this idea that, look, the basic problem of a consumer society is that we're busy producing, and yet it's generating no satisfaction. So the question is, why this compulsive character of our consumption? One clue that may help us to resolve the mystery is the fact that there is still a positive correlation between relative wealth and happiness. Right? So in our society, absolute wealth above a certain point is essentially irrelevant to happiness. There's no correlation. But relative wealth is still correlated with happiness. So in other words, while merely having money can't make you happy, having more money than other people provides a pretty good start. Now, one hypothesis, the hypothesis that we find most persuasive to explain this, is the one that was proposed with the greatest clarity in the 70s by Fred Hirsch in his book called The Social Limits to Growth. Hirsch observed that in a very poor country, the basic problem is that people lack material goods. Economic growth is able to expand the supply of these goods. It allows us to manufacture more food, more housing, more clothing, and so forth. And thus, growth generates lasting improvements in people's welfare. In our society, by contrast, material scarcity has been almost completely eliminated. And so the typical consumer's income is spent mostly on what Hirsch calls positional goods, or goods for which access is determined not by absolute, but rather by relative ability to pay. Some examples of positional goods include a penthouse apartment, a congestion-free highway, or a PhD. These are all goods that are subject to social, not material scarcity. So we can't make more of them. Not everybody can live in a penthouse, right? Because somebody has to live in the apartments beneath it. And so there's social scarcity in terms of apartments. Not everybody can drive on an open road. And of course, we can't give everybody a PhD. If we did, we'd have to invent some other higher accreditation in order to figure out who gets to teach at universities. But the best illustration of the positional good phenomenon is actually real estate, and it's also the most economically significant because that's what people spend their big money on. It's a commonplace observation that real estate prices are determined by location, location, location. We sometimes forget the extent to which this is true. My house in downtown Toronto, just down the street, is over 100 years old, slightly over 15 feet wide, and has about 1,200 square feet of interior space. It's a generic 3-story row house, virtually identical to the 22 other houses on my side of the block. The real estate market has been quite robust lately, as you all know, so houses in my row have been selling for over $400,000. Needless to say, the same house in another location would not be worth quite as much. In fact, just down the road in Hamilton, you can buy an identical house on a lot of the same size for around $60,000. Whenever I tell people in Toronto this, no one believes me, but I actually went on the MLS website and found a house exactly like me. It's a generic house. Found a house exactly the same size as mine that was selling for about $57,000. All right, so obviously the price of downtown real estate has very little to do with the materials that go into the construction of a dwelling. It has to do with how many other people want to live there. This is easy to notice when you buy a house in the city because there are often multiple bids on houses in attractive locations. Thus, the eventual sale price of the house will be determined entirely by how much it takes to outbid other potential buyers. Yet, while it is possible for developers to respond to rising house prices by building more houses, it is impossible for them to create more good locations. Downtown real estate is intrinsically scarce simply because downtown is where most people want to live. If they didn't, it wouldn't be downtown, it would be somewhere else. Thus, the quest for location, like the quest for status, for example, is very close to being a zero-sum game. And of course, it's even worse in the United States, where the quality of public schools varies dramatically from neighborhood to neighborhood. And so consumers are competing with one another to get into good school districts as well. In the end, those who buy into good districts inexorably squeeze out those who are unable or unwilling to pay. Thus, access to desirable real estate is determined by one's relative ability to pay. It's like being a member of an exclusive club. For every winner, there must be a loser. And what is that if not competitive consumption? So I think the crucial point is that you're not necessarily engaging in competitive consumption because you feel like you're engaging in consumption or because you envy the Joneses or what have you, right? In other words, you don't have to be motivated by any of these sorts of base concerns about relative position. The fact is there are lots of types of goods that are intrinsically competitive because of their positional nature. So buying real estate, or renting for that matter, is necessarily competitive because of the structure of that market. It doesn't matter how you feel about the other people in the market. You're still competing with them. And it has a zero-sum structure. This happens, of course, not just downtown. People who buy in the suburbs are generally looking for easy access to the city combined with open space and quality of life associated with the country. Yet because this can only be achieved at the outer perimeter of the city, each new suburban development leapfrogs existing suburbs, creating the familiar expanding donut pattern of urban growth. Urban sprawl, in other words, is a race to the bottom, driven by a quest for good location. Now, you can't fix the problem by trying to get away from it all either, because when you do that, you're also embroiled in competition. Each person who stakes out a piece of unspoiled wilderness or an isolated tract of land makes it that much harder for anybody else to get away from it all because you're there, right? So it's like wanting to drive on an open road. Your presence denies that good to other people. So because positional goods are intrinsically scarce, economic growth does nothing to increase their supply. An increase in my salary, insofar as it's just based on general growth in the economy, does not help me to buy a nicer house or a more luxurious car when all of my neighbors receive exactly the same increments in their salary. It simply increases the price of these goods. Furthermore, we may all consume more and more in a quest to achieve these positional goods. We commute further and further, we enroll our children in 100 different extracurricular activities, private schools, we redecorate the house more and more often. Economic growth begins to resemble a giant arms race rather than a system of production aimed at satisfying human need. This is why, according to Hirsch, economic growth in our society, rather than reducing the frustrations of the middle classes, has tended rather to exacerbate it. Early industrialization, in Hirsch's view, created unrealistic expectations because it permitted the population at large to enjoy many of the privileges that had once been reserved for the wealthy alone, like indoor plumbing, central heating, and things like that. So people got this idea that, oh, as we get richer, I'm someday going to be able to have all the things that wealthy people have today. But those days are long gone, Hirsch argues. What the wealthy have today can no longer be delivered to the rest of us tomorrow. Yet as we individually grow richer, this is what we expect. Why? Because almost all disposable income is being dedicated to the pursuit of positional goods. Thus, the problem of the consumer society is that as we become wealthier, most of our consumption becomes dedicated to the attainment of positional goods, which in turn locks us into zero-sum competitive consumption. Thus, economic growth becomes no longer the panacea that it once was. It produces no increase in overall satisfaction. Yet we remain locked into the high growth pattern with all the compromises it entails, simply because the competitive structure of our consumption makes it prohibitively difficult for individuals to drop out of the race. And so there's our diagnosis of what the problem of consumerism is, right? In our diagnosis, the problem is not conformity. The problem fundamentally is competitive consumption. So let me now bring these elements together and try to explain the claim then made at the beginning of the paper that the type of countercultural politics exemplified by Adbusters magazine, far from being a revolutionary doctrine that threatens to undermine capitalism, is actually one of the major forces driving consumerism. To begin with, it's important to notice that countercultural rebellion serves as a very important source of distinction. The critique of mass society portrays the typical consumer as a conformist, a mindless victim of advertising and corporate manipulation. Given this characterization, most people would want to show that they are not one of these mindless conformists, not one of the sheep or the lemmings going over the hill or however you want to represent it. So how do you show that you're not a victim of brainwashing and advertising? By becoming a rebel consumer, by refusing to live in the suburbs, refusing to drive a minivan, refusing to wear a suit and tie, or otherwise consume mainstream products and services. The problem is that not everybody can be a rebel. In fact, this sort of rebellion is itself a positional good, and that's our crucial claim, right? Countercultural rebellion is a positional good. For example, everybody would love to listen to fabulous underground bands that nobody's ever heard of before, but unfortunately not all of us can do this. Once too many people find out about the latest great band, then they are no longer underground. And so we said that they've sold out or gone mainstream or that they've been co-opted by the system. What has really happened is simply that too many people have started buying their albums, so that listening to them no longer serves as a source of distinction. The real rebels, therefore, have to go off and find some new band to listen to that nobody else knows about in order to preserve this distinction and their sense of superiority over others. The same basic pattern manifests itself in any number of areas, including art, film, haircuts, food, footwear, speech patterns, travel destinations, living locations, employment, and a dozen other lifestyle choices. Something starts out as underground, alternative, or subversive, known only to the non-conforming rebels. Then the alternative press starts to talk about it, soon the mainstream media starts to talk about it, and the next thing you know, everybody's in on the action. And so the rebel has to move on, and the cycle of obsolescence begins once again. The key point is that this process of rebellion and co-optation is not a plot on the part of the system to stifle dissent. In fact, we don't think there is any such thing as co-optation in the countercultural sense. What gets called co-optation is entirely a product of competitive consumption on the part of rebel consumers. Advertising has almost nothing to do with it. At best, it simply helps out those who are late to the party find their way. Now, thanks to the myth of counterculture and the ideology of the rebel consumer, many of the people who are most opposed to consumerism nevertheless actively participate in the sort of behavior that drives it. Consider Naomi Klein. She starts out her book, No Logo, by decrying the recent conversion of factory buildings in her Toronto neighborhood to, quote, loft living condominiums. She makes it clear, though, to the reader that her place is the real deal, a genuine factory loft, steeped in working class authenticity, yet throbbing with urban street culture, and what she calls a, quote, rock video aesthetic. Klein also drops enough hints about her neighborhood that any reader familiar with Toronto knows that she was living in the King Spadina area. And any reader with a feel for how social class in Canada works would know that at the time Klein was writing, a genuine factory loft in the King Spadina area was one of the coolest, most desirable pieces of real estate in the country. Unlike merely expensive neighborhoods in Toronto, like Rosedale and Forest Hill, where it is possible to buy your way in, genuine factory lofts in Klein's neighborhood could be acquired only by people with superior social connections. This is because they contravened zoning regulations and so could not be bought or leased on the open market. Only the most exclusive segment of the cultural elite, the genuinely cool people, could get access to them. Unfortunately for Klein, the city of Toronto, as part of a very enlightened and successful strategy to slow urban sprawl, decided to rezone all the downtown neighborhoods to permit mixed usages. King Spadina was rezoned to permit any combination of industrial, commercial, and residential use. Before long, an enormous revitalization of the neighborhood began as old warehouses and factories were renovated, condominium complexes were built, new restaurants opened, and so forth. Yet from Klein's perspective, this was a disaster. Why? because the rezoning allowed yuppies to buy their way into her neighborhood, something they previously could not do. What's wrong with yuppies? Other than being yuppies, what crime did they commit? Klein claims, of course, no one's actually a yuppie, right? Like, I know people who are such yuppies who complain about yuppies. Part of our point. Anyhow, Klein claims that these yuppies brought with them, quote, a painful new self-consciousness to the neighborhood. But as the rest of her introduction to No Logo demonstrates, she too is conscious, painfully so, of her surroundings. She describes her neighborhood as one where, quote, in the 20s and 30s, Russian and Polish immigrants darted back and forth, ducking into delis to argue about Trotsky and the leadership of the International Ladies Garment Workers Union. Emma Goldman, we are told, the famed anarchist and labor leader, once lived on her street. How exciting for Klein. What a tremendous source of distinction that must be. It is here we can see the true nature of her complaint. The arrival of yuppies led to an erosion of her social status. Her complaints about commercialization are nothing but an expression of this loss of distinction. 10 years ago, saying, I live in a loft at King's Spadina, sent a very clear message to anybody with ears to listen. It said, I am extremely cool, quite possibly cooler than you. But with a dozen new condominium complexes and a flood of yuppies, the noise threatens to drown out the signal. When you say you live in a loft at King's Spadina, how will people know that you live in a real loft and not just one of those yuppie ones? Klein can see only one solution. If the landlord decides to convert her building to condominiums, she will have to move out. She discusses this in No Logo as though it were self-evident. Yet if the landlord decides to convert her building, why not just buy her loft? The problem, of course, is that a loft-living condominium doesn't have quite the cachet of a genuine industrial loft. It becomes, as Klein puts it, merely an apartment with, quote, exceptionally high ceilings. Here we can see the real problem. It's not the landlord threatening to drive her from the neighborhood, it's the fear of loss of distinction. What Klein fails to observe is that the cachet associated with her neighborhood is precisely what's driving the real estate market. It's what creates the value of all those yuppie loft-living condominiums. People buy these lofts because they want to be cool like Naomi Klein. Or more specifically, they want some of her social status. And naturally, she's not amused. This is a demonstration of the forces driving competitive consumption in their starkest form. The extraordinary thing is that they pass completely unnoticed, even though they occur in the introduction of a book that has become adopted as the Bible of the anti-consumerism movement. So here we have the paradox of anti-consumerism. The major remedy for the consumer society, which has been adopted almost without question by the left and by cultural radicals more generally, has been one of the most powerful forces driving consumer capitalism. The Adbusters sneaker is just the latest, most extraordinary example. This is why we say the countercultural rebellion is not a threat to the system, but rather has become the system. To conclude. In the Rebel Cell, what we're offering is what we call, not everyone calls, but what we call a left-wing critique of countercultural thinking. What makes it left-wing? Most of us are familiar with the right-wing critique of counterculture, from Alan Bloom's Closing of the American Mind to David Fromm's book about the 70s, How We Got Here. What these critics share with the counterculture is the conviction that nonconformity represents a genuine threat to the system or to the established order. The right wing simply thinks that the system is good and therefore should not be overthrown. Thus, Fromm laments things like rising divorce rates, the prospect of gay marriage, while Alan Bloom demonizes Mick Jagger for his role in corrupting the youth and turning them away from the wisdom found in the great books. For those of you keeping score, that's now Sir Mick Jagger, peer of the realm. Keith Richards actually got upset when Mick Jagger got knighted. He accused him of selling out, which I thought was nice. It suggests that Keith Richards believes that he himself has not yet done that. As you can see, we reject the idea that the sort of nonconformity that characterizes countercultural rebellion is any threat to the system whatsoever. What we share with the countercultural left, though, is a recognition that all is not well in our society and that there is much that can be improved. There is too much poverty and inequality, both within Canada and between the developed and the developing world. There's overwork, that is, average hours worked have increased in North America in the last decade, which is something which makes, for the most part, absolutely no sense. So we need to make sure, for example, that globalization makes things better, not worse. We need to be on guard against environmental degradation and unsustainable economic activities exacerbated by excessive consumption. Finally, Klein and her followers are right. We're swimming in a sea of advertising, and much of it is unwelcome, and some of it is positively reprehensible. Where we disagree with the countercultural left is over the means we should use to achieve our goals on these and other issues. We reject the supposedly deeper cultural solutions to these problems and prefer to work through institutions using legislative or market-based initiatives whenever possible. To deal with the excesses of competitive consumption among students, for example, we recommend a return to mandatory school uniforms in public schools, Pink Floyd aside. This actually is a nice example of how conformity can actually solve the problem of consumerism by eliminating competitive consumption. When it comes to the environment, a system of tradable pollution permits would do more to alleviate atmospheric pollution than any Think Globally, Act Locally initiative. Finally, if we're really worried about advertising and the brand bullies, it would be enormously easy to strike a devastating blow against the practice with a simple change in the tax code. The government could stop treating advertising expenditures as a fully tax-deductible business expense, much as they did with entertainment expenses in Canada several years ago. Advertising is already a separately itemized expense category, so the change wouldn't even generate any additional paperwork for business. But this little tweak in the tax code would have a greater impact on advertising than all of the cultural jamming in the world. Yet these and other institutional reforms are systematically rejected or undervalued by the countercultural left on the grounds that they are coercive or that they buy into the logic of the system. This tendency to reject institutional initiatives leads countercultural activists and thinkers to ignore perfectly good solutions to concrete social problems in the name of deeper or more radical alternatives that can never be effectively implemented. By rejecting any proposal that stops short of a total transformation of human consciousness and culture, countercultural activists too often wind up exacerbating precisely the problems they were hoping to solve. Thus, countercultural thinking in our analysis is not merely unhelpful, it often positively impedes our ability to bring about the reforms necessary to the achievement of increased welfare and social justice in our society. Thank you.
It's a big question, and our answer, well, I'll say something and maybe Joel will jump in. We were just talking about organic today. One problem, I mean, I sat on a panel about consumerism last year, and at the end of it, we all had to go around and give one suggestion for doing something about consumerism. And the first person said that, he said, I really think what we need to do is make sure we get our clothes handmade locally if we can, buy from local manufacturers, and have shoes handmade if you can. And the next guy said, yeah, I think you should eat organically and source all your produce locally as much as you can, right? I mean, the first answer to that is that does nothing but solving consumerism, right? We're still shopping. The second answer is this distinction you want to draw between corporate things that the corporations give you and stuff the local people give you. Well, it's a bit of a fraudulent distinction when you sort of realize that companies like Starbucks and the Gap both started as tiny little boutiques in San Francisco and Seattle offering this sort of little rebellious product to people. And they got big, right? Because lots of people wanted the distinction that goes along with that. And so those are two answers. A third answer is organic produce. Joe and I were talking about this today. It's very expensive. I mean, where's the biggest organic produce grocery store in town, right? It's in Yorkville. New York. Oh, sorry, I don't live here anymore. It's in Yorkville, right? And it's very expensive. And where are the really good organic restaurants, right? Well, they're not in Parkdale, and they're not in Regent Park. And so you need to realize that what you're doing here is engaging in practices that might be, for a lot of people, about gaining status and not necessarily about doing anything else. I mean, I certainly haven't heard any left-wing people advocate for subsidies or food stamps for the poor to go buy organic produce to Whole Foods. I mean, that certainly hasn't been mooted, as far as I can tell.
Yeah, I just want to say, one of the points we make in the book, and we're heavily influenced by this really nice book that I've never seen discussed called The 60s by Arthur Marwick, a historian. And one of the points he makes that I think, our two central academic sources for this, where we've sort of taken ideas, is from, first of all, Thomas Frank, as we mentioned in the paper, and then Marwick. Because both of them, Thomas Frank is the one who caught on to this idea that it's countercultural rebellion driving consumerism. And he didn't articulate it that clearly, but he clearly is the pioneer of this critique. And then Marwick thematizes the countercultural idea and treats it theoretically in a way that we found really, really helpful in formulating our thought. But one of Marwick's points is that basically the counterculture has been intensely entrepreneurial from the get-go. And he does, of course, I was born in late 60s. I have no living memory of all this sort of stuff. But there are all these, if you look at the fashion industry or if you look at cosmetics and beauty and so on, it's extraordinary the number of people who all got their start in the counterculture in London. Like Vidal Sassoon, it never occurred to me that he was like a rebel at one point, right? But the counterculture has, the do-it-yourself scene, this idea that it's virtuous to do things, you put on your own gig or whatever, instead of, buying mass-produced music and so forth, right? That's the spirit of capitalism, right? That's called entrepreneurship. And it's not an accident that from the very beginning, people have been making real money out of countercultural activities. Why? Because often the counterculture generates better products. And as a result, they, quote, sell out, right? So as we say, it's not an accident that San Francisco is the home of the $3 latte and the $4 sourdough. It was because the counterculture made better bread, better coffee, and then that generates the formula that gave the world Starbucks, right? There's nothing wrong with engaging in these sorts of activities, but I'm not sure in what sense any of them are virtuous, and certainly none of them are contrary to the corporate system. If anything, the counterculture is an incubator for the corporate system.
Joe and I both sort of think, yeah, to a certain extent. I in particular, and people are probably getting tired of hearing this rant, right? But I was really annoyed during the last federal election campaign with the amount of media attention that was paid to the alienated voter, right? That was the most popular voter, right? Was the voter who thought that all politicians were liars, right? And that no matter who won, the system was going to get in anyway, or something ridiculous like this, right? And there was a group of people going around advocating eating your ballot, right, as the only way of truly jamming the system, the Edible Ballot Society, and they got lots of play on the CBC and so on, without anybody actually saying, hey, are you stupid or what, right? And it was really obnoxious. And I think telling people that no matter what they do, the system's still going to be there is a really unhelpful way of approaching the system. There's nothing wrong with piecemeal change, but it's a lot of work. And I think, for a lot of people, it's too much work, and they prefer the parties that go on all night at the latest culture jam or the anti-globalization protest. And yeah, that's square advice, but politics is an extremely square endeavor.
Maybe I'll just say something on that as well. I think an example of how little power we have as consumers, this is sort of, I think, is going to be looked back on as the morality tale of the late 20th century, is SUVs. Where it's a good example of, SUVs are safer in one respect, which is that if you run into somebody, the person in the larger vehicle is more likely to survive the crash than the person in the smaller vehicle. And so it's a good example of safety in that respect is a positional good, right? In other words, it's not the absolute size of your vehicle that guarantees your safety. It's the relative size of your vehicle that guarantees your safety. And so people have an incentive to buy vehicles larger than the average vehicle on the road. And because of that, it sets off a race to the bottom, whereby people then have to buy larger and larger and larger vehicles in order to protect their safety, their kids, whatever. What can you do as a consumer? Well, you can clearly, I drive a Mini, so obviously I've opted out of that particular arms race. But frankly, all that does is it makes it a lot easier for other people to run around in their SUVs and see right over my hood. And also, it doesn't address the fundamental problem, which is that I'm accepting a major compromise in safety in order to drive a smaller car. So I'm being virtuous, but it doesn't really solve the problem. And the only thing in the case of, so when we talk about traditional political action, the only thing that's going to fix that problem of expanding vehicle size is a regulatory solution. I just can't possibly imagine, or a price solution, right? Gas prices may someday do it. But I just can't see how any sort of consumer-based or moral solution is ever going to work, simply because it generates the exploitation of the moral by the immoral, right? The people who are willing to play along just make it that much more beneficial for the people who refuse to play along. So unless you've got some laws in there, you simply can't resolve the problem. The claim was that we've mischaracterized the left by suggesting that it's all about trivial countercultural politics, whereas in fact it's all about bread and butter issues. I think, of course, that at no point do we say that the left is the counterculture. What we say is that countercultural thinking has had an enormous influence upon the left, and that influence has been unhelpful. There's no question that back in the 60s, the political activists, the civil rights movement, the anti-war movement, and the counterculture regarded themselves as being very, very distinct and often antagonistic. In the 70s, the two got sort of blurred, so often it's difficult to tell the difference between the two of them. But, I mean, let me give you an example of the proposal I made at the very end, a proposal about advertising, eliminating the tax deductibility of advertising as a business expense. It's an idea that comes from Robert Frank, an economist at Cornell. It's gotten no play on the left. And when you think about no logo, of course, there's all sorts of issues, there's all sorts of discussion of third world poverty and factory conditions and so on and so forth. But the core thesis of the book is that governments are controlled by corporations, and corporations are able, the root of corporate power is the brand. In other words, it's the colonization of consciousness which gives corporations the capacity to dictate public policy. Therefore, rather than engaging in direct political action, where you're playing basically a rigged game, what you need to attack is the root of the system which leads to corporate domination, and that's advertising, right? So you have a very clearly articulated theory, which says that, I mean, it diagnoses all kinds of problems, but what does it say about the solution? It says that the solution is to attack advertising. And that's based upon a theory which has its origins in this critique of mass society that we think is false. Now, think about it for a minute. I mean, look at the seriousness of the issues which Klein lays out in No Logo, right? And then she says, let's address this by attacking brands. Well, what if the theory that says that brands are responsible for all this was mistaken? What a disastrous political miscalculation to want to treat issues of that level of seriousness with the kind of, what we take to be very, very trivial and superficial, culture jamming type politics. But our proposal, for example, for eliminating the tax deductibility of advertising, not only is not mooted and has gotten no play on the left, we've actually encountered significant resistance to it. Like irate letters to the editor of this magazine saying that people are not interested in our kind of superficial solutions to the problems of advertising. That they want something deeper, a way of transforming consciousness. I mean, people use those actual words in objecting to our proposal. Now, insofar as that remains a powerful element in the left, I think there's value in developing this kind of critique. I have to say, actually, there was a chapter cut out of the book where we actually had an extensive discussion of cosmetics in the beauty industry. So, let me say briefly what the argument was. There I complained about the other Naomi Wolf, because the beauty myth is, you read it carefully, it is an absolutely orthodox presentation of the countercultural theory. In other words, beauty in her view is an ideology which is designed to impose repression upon women, ultimately to not deny them pleasure. The way the countercultural idea then formulates is in terms of the following analysis. It says, look, what the industry does through advertising is they set up archetypes of female beauty. And then women, being conformists, try to look like women in the magazines. And so it's a system of conformity, fundamentally, of how cosmetics and beauty function. It's that compulsive conformity which therefore generates consumerism amongst women and the unproductive spending on cosmetics when the money could be used for more useful endeavors. Now, we think that's a fundamentally mistaken analysis of how this works, because again, consumerism is not about conformity. What that analysis completely ignores is the competitive structure of beauty. So this idea that there are archetypes which then people try to conform to is really not how beauty works, right? People get very, very tangible advantages from being more beautiful than the people around them. Being the best looking person in your office, being the best looking person in the bar. What matters is not how, whether you look like, Linda Evangelista. What matters is that you look better than the people who are your competition in the bar or at work or wherever you may be, right? That's where you get the advantages from. And therefore, what drives the cosmetics industry largely, and I think you can see this really clearly in plastic surgery, is competition amongst consumers. What the corporations are doing is they're basically functioning like arms merchants. Like they're supplying materials, but they're not the ones who are creating the conflict. Ultimately, it's competitive behavior. And that's why the kind of prescriptions that Naomi Wolf gives in The Beauty Myth are unhelpful, because her view is, it's all a big ideology. You need to just snap out of it, right? You need to just kind of realize one day that there's this giant system of repression that wants you to conform. And so you're supposed to just kind of stop, right? Well, and of course, every woman I know read that book and none of them stopped, right? Because why? Because it fails to recognize the competitive structure of beauty. And the fact is that if you drop out of that competition, just like if you decide not to buy a bigger car or you decide not to buy desirable real estate, if you decide not to participate and make use of any cosmetic products that are available or fashionable clothing or whatever, right? In other words, if you decide to look dumpy, you suffer severe social consequences for that. Less so in a university than in life outside the university, right? But I think that's why, people read this book and it doesn't do anything to affect their behavior. Because the book misdiagnoses the problem, suggests that it's an ideology when in fact it's not. So actually, I'm glad you asked the question because our poor chapter, which got cut out, tries to identify this as a classic example of countercultural thinking. And it also shows the extent to which countercultural thinking has seriously dominated feminist thought since the 1960s as well.
On the face of it, I think it's certainly the case that you'd be hard-pressed to find a genuine culture that does not have a status hierarchy. I mean, I don't think there ever has been one, right? What that says about anything natural, I don't know. It certainly says something about the circumstances in which humans find themselves. Part of the problem is that in North American society and so on, right, we have this, we live under the ethos of authenticity, individuality, and so on, right, which puts a premium on, Apollonius's injunction to Laertes, right, this above all to thine own self be true, right. Now, the problem becomes when being an individual suddenly becomes not doing what you want to do, but doing what other people aren't doing, right? That instantly puts you into the competitive cycle, right, against the masses. And you can see this, I mean, it didn't come in necessarily the counterculture. You find it in Emerson, right? In his essay Self-Reliance, Emerson says, right, he who would be a man must first become a nonconformist, right? Stay away from the masses and so on. So it's certainly this idea that you distance yourself from others and distinguish yourself, who you are as an individual, is essentially distinguished from what other people are doing, right? It's certainly an essential part of the ideology of our society. And you'd have to do a lot of work to get rid of that. I mean, Joe and I actually say, look, at one point in the book, you want to be a rebel, right? Wear a uniform. You want to strike a blow against consumers in the society, wear the exact same thing every day, right? We had a professor, a colleague of Joe's, a professor of mine, right? Wears the exact same thing every day, right? Why? He's a communist, right? And he knows, right? This is how you do it.
And we mean that in the nicest way.
In the nicest way, right? Yeah. The Varsity once ran a photo of him.
He's a communist, bless his soul.
Bless his soul, right? The Varsity once ran a photo of him sitting at a desk on like a career day or something like that. It said, "The last communist on earth," right? And he's sitting there with this. Because there are only really two ways of rebelling, right? Either do something extremely criminal, right? Charles Manson was a rebel, right? Or you actually strike a blow against consumers by, don't engage in the process of distinction. Well, thanks, guys. It's been great.